So welcome everyone. My name is Platon Messias. I'm the program head of Projective Cities MPhil in Architecture and Urban Design. I would like to welcome you all to the fourth lecture within the Practice and the Pedagogies lecture series that we're organizing this term. We are incredibly happy and honored to welcome back Chris Lee. Chris is the co-founder of this program and a very, very good friend with whom we also study together at the Berliner. So we're incredibly happy that he is with us this morning. Christopher Lee is the principal and co-founder of Serie Architects and Arthur Rotch design critic in architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. His talk today will discuss the productive tension between the precision of pedagogy and the messiness of practice. So, Chris, the virtual wall floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Platon. Thanks, Hamid. Thanks, Manier, for this invitation. It's really great to be back among friends. Yeah, so I thought when you asked, can you do the lunchtime lecture, I thought it was brilliant. We definitely I'll do this because, as they say, right, the presentation before lunch, the audience is grumpy. The one after lunch is sleepy. So I think the lunch is they are contented and distracted, well, provided if the lunch is excellent. So I hope you guys are munching away on your aromatic crispy duck with lobster noodles next. So I'll keep this a bit more informal. So I think perhaps just share really snippets of I think, as Platon has said, some of our obsessions in the practice and in the teaching. A lot of it actually arose out of the PhD that I did alongside Platon Hamid, together with Pierre Vittorio at the time, and the way in which it leads to a certain pedagogy, and then of course from there on to practice, right? The one caution though, you will of course find there are themes that are consistent across the three, but what you will not see, I think, it's that we do not create projects that illustrate theory, right? We really think that that's not the way one should practice, but theory should inform practice, but practice should never illustrate theory. So I'll jump straight into it. So I will break the presentation down to three. First, I'll talk about why we think our approach could be summarized as a propensity for accommodation. I will speak a little bit about the pedagogy of teaching, both, actually started from the AA and now in GSD. I'll also show some of research and studio projects of GSD of late, and then I will jump to a couple of projects in practice, yeah? All right, so I think for the word accommodation, really, I think if we look at the etymology of the word, I think what I found best is that it says that there's for accommodation is that it is to make fit or make fit for. So I think this desire to fit and make fit for, and therefore to accommodate really stems a lot from how our personal circumstances, or my personal circumstances, and our belief that how architecture should be, as a practice and artifact that both should bridge divides and accommodate this difference, especially in the lighter end of the challenges posed by globalization, divisions, and climate change that we see today. So this interest really arose partly out of our situation, from the situation that we found ourselves as young architects, actually growing from locations all over the world. And I think when there's a discussion I had with Ron Witt of GSD, that he puts it very well, the way in which we approach this is that we were in the world before we were known to the world. And I thought that was a very apt summary, because in a way, when we started, we didn't have a large portfolio. And at the same time, we found ourselves confronting social, cultural, and political issues that were very, very diverse from all the sites that we looked at. So it became very apparent very quickly that because we grew in London, in Mumbai from the start, that we were both foreign and local or indigenous at the same time. And the two common routes to practice in this globalized context is either one, become a global architect with a signature style, so often non-contextual, propped up by claims of progress and technologically driven usually, and that signature is then proliferated around the world. Now, at the other opposite end, there's also the role of the so-called local architect, the indigenous architect, as a gatekeeper of a particular cultural essence, where the architect usually, in Western media will celebrate for their Chineseness, Indianness, and so on. But I think both these approaches we felt were not satisfactory for us, because the thing that is common between these two is that they focus too much on the uniqueness of local culture or the uniqueness of the signature style that to be proliferated. So instead, in other words, they wanted to be different, right? Create architecture that is distinct and different. We instead actually wanted to do something different. We want to take an opposite direction and to focus on what is common rather than what sets us apart. And this is why we felt that the need to accommodate, the need to, in a sense, make fit and make fit for is something that allows us to, in a sense, claim a certain relevance to a certain cultural, social, and political relevance to our work in the different sites that we were working in. So therefore, the natural, we thought when we started, was that the space of coexistence and plurality par excellence is the city. And we contend that this approach for architecture's propensity for accommodation really could come through the discursive notion of the persistent architecture of the city, essentially looking at the dominant types of the city and the architecture that has persisted. That is to say that to look at architecture that arises out of the lessons drawn from the typical elements of the city, so that it resonates with a certain common familiarity and purpose. And of course, we are indebted to Rossi, especially the way in which he discusses the way in which architecture acts as a collective work of art. And this premise, of course, has been highlighted famously in The Architecture of the City, and in which he puts forth the concept of the urban artifact. And for Rossi, the urban artifact, as we know, is divided to two: housing and monument as rule and exception. Housing, of course, is this usually carries the same deep structure that then is proliferated and multiplied across the fabric of the city, that then is disrupted or punctuated by another deep structure, an organizational structure that is different to that of housing. So for instance, in churches and libraries and other buildings. So this in a way, we thought summarizes, this is a cartoon by Leon Krier. It really summarizes the architecture that embodies the idea of this historical European city, which is the rule and the exception, the rule being the housing, the space of economic, and then the exception is the public buildings as a manifestation of collective will and collective agreement. And I think also one of the key instrumentality of Rossi's reading of the urban artifact, we felt, was this. Essentially, he says that an urban artifact is an urban artifact, both housing or monument, is so because it has two characteristics. One is that it is a permanent structure, and the other is that it is also propelling. In other words, when he says it is a permanent structure, he uses this example of Palazzo di Ragione. He says that this permanent structure has persisted in time, and it has also acted as a propelling element of the city because it is transparent to programmatic failures. It is transparent to function or indifferent to function. So the same permanent structure has hosted a residence for the aristocrats, have been turned into a military barracks, to a market, and then to schools and so on. And because it has involved in the life of the city and is able to transform with the demands and desire of the city, it collects the memory of the city. The memory of the city is secreted onto this permanent structure. So we felt that this reading of a certain revalidation of architecture role in the city, we felt was incredibly important to us. Another fact that is often not discussed in Rossi's work is that the diagram or the plan that he placed at the bottom right, and in which you could see that the same sort of stoa loggia structure with elongated walls are then taken from this reading, these two moments of the urban artifact to his other projects. So these are the diagrams that Rossi has done. The top is Triennale project that uses a series of elongated walls with different spacing that then face onto the river, but also it becomes a series of rooms. They create a series of rooms that begins to contract, expand, elongates, that creates this diversity of room that it draws from a certain persistent architecture of the city. And at the middle diagrams, you will see that that's the project by same project by Rossi. It is Galarata's housing. And again, it uses the same deep structure. So here, as I said, the Milan structure, and then here is used again in Galarata's housing, in which the same structure, the fineness of the structure that is provided by the rooms, by the walls to create rooms for dwelling that gives a certain domestic scale, is imprinted on the ground and turns a passage into a colonnaded corridor. And this colonnaded corridor is not made of orders, but in fact is made of those elongated walls that bears the traces of domesticity from the top of the mass to the bottom. So in this way, I think Rossi brought these two moments of the urban artifact, both housing and monument, into a single gesture that is the architecture of the city. So I thought this is something that we felt is incredibly productive and also point us in many ways in which we work. Now, looking eastwards, if we could say that the rule and exception through the typical architecture of the city, the persistent architecture of the city defines the historical European city. We could say that in the Eastern tradition, especially through countries or nations that subscribe to a Confucius ethics and yin and yang philosophy, we could say that there is all rule without exception. Why I say so is that we could say that the entire structure of the city is made up of one dominant type or persistent architecture. That is the courtyard house. But this courtyard house, of course, should not be confused with other courtyard configurations the world over, because the most pronounced difference here is that the void of the courtyard is carved out. It's not carved out of a mass, but instead they are formed by the placement of one or two single room pavilions that are then walled off from its surrounding. And this courtyard houses then aggregates to form entire neighborhoods, hutong as they call it in Beijing pre-48, leaving very narrow lanes between the courtyard houses. And they also are not articulated or designed or built to articulate a form of frontal elevation, for it will not be viewed in axial perspective from a distance like the Renaissance. Instead, it is experienced as a sequence, moving from wall to courtyard to pavilion and yet to another courtyard. So this sequence of open and closed space, a space for nature and dwelling, and this constant alternation adheres to what we call a yin-yang concept of the alternation of binary opposite. So in a sense, it figures forth and it embodies these philosophical ideas of Chinese civilization. And we could say that the same singular deep structure defines, therefore, the entire city at various scales, from the outer perimeter of the city of the aerial view that I showed you. If you scale it down, it bears the same deep structure of the Forbidden City with 1,000 pavilions and walls. And if we scale them down again, you would see that it creates the courtyard houses that houses a multitude of programmatic diversity, from administrative buildings, of course, in Qing Dynasty at that time, to houses, to hospitals, to clinics, to clans association, and so on. So we could say that, therefore, this same deep structure has that propensity, again, to be a framework of accommodation, as much as we saw the way in which the European, let's say the idea of the historical European city through Rossi also bears those traces of its propensity to accommodate difference. Another example that I always like to share is that illuminates our thinking about type and its trope of precedence, seriality, and commonality. It's a work by Edmund de Waal. So here, for instance, what I found truly amazing is that each and every one of these objects are obsessively made. They belong to the same family, but within that same family, we could also say that precisely they share something similar or in common for it to be able to be called belong to the same family. And also the way in which de Waal brings this within the frame and to make those differences meaningful. And the frame here not only becomes a platform for singularity to exist in difference, but more importantly, I think it declares that what is common among the singularities. So again, I think what is also we found interesting is the way, of course, de Waal also pays as much attention to creating the platforms or the frames as much as he does in creating the variation and difference and the seriality that you find in his work. So those are some of our obsessions and why we felt looking at the city, looking at the architecture of the city and its persistent architecture allows us to think about architecture's propensity to accommodate. So in teaching, of course, one has to be a bit more precise, and I think the word pedagogy here is rightly put, I think, by this lecture series by Hamid and Platon, in which pedagogy, the etymology of the word, essentially is the science of teaching, right? That is to say that it is repeatable and it is consistent, and that has a logic behind it, and it is rational. So the two proponents that influence the way in which I think about pedagogy is Carlo Giulio Argan, who have written a famous essay in 1963, and Duron, as well as an architect / teacher that was working in the age of the revolutionary France. So without going into too much detail, I'll just give you a quick summary of how their ideas and how it influences us. So with Argan, and in his famous essay on the typology of architecture of 1963, Argan starts by acknowledging the two theorists and architects who have contributed to the understanding of concept of type in architecture. So the first one that you see is basically the understanding of the concept of type via quatermain-de-Quincy. That is to say that the type is an ideal, and it's an ideal, an idea that should serve as a rule for the model to create variations. So in other words, it works with this Platonic idea of the metaphysics, where, for instance, the idea of a bed is always an ideal, precisely because it is able to create an endless variation of beds. And because it is able to create an endless variation of beds, it could never recreate the idea that gave rise to it. So the idea is always ideal, and thereby brings the question of the origin that resides on the realm of the metaphysics. So I won't go too much into it, but I'll just tell you Argan's version. I think Argan's version, and I think in many ways his contribution to the concept of type, is that he allows us to think about allows us to think about buildings as precedents, and using precedents to arrive at a particular detection of the type. So he says that the type, in Argan's word, is said to arise when we are able to detect a series of things, objects, or building that has a certain shared characteristic. And when we have understood those shared characteristics, we could also say that we have understood its interior structure and root form. And if we accept this root form and interior structure, which also holds a certain ideological, historical, and cultural content, we can then create further variations. So it is not, and Argan would use examples. For instance, he would say that if we look at, let's say, the three circular temples here, the root form of the circular temple has not changed, and it carries a certain cultural and ideological component and content, but the way in which it could create variation is incredibly rich, right? So for instance, we could see the circular temple, which is perched on a hill in Tivoli, and then the same circular temple is now enclosed and confined in the courtyard of a church with regards to Bramante's Tempietto. And then, of course, with Ren, the same circular temple now is then perched on the roof, placed above the altar of St. Paul's Cathedral. So following Aragon, we could say that a type has arisen. The root structure, the root form, and the interior structure, or in my terms, a reducible deep structure is detected and is derived, and we could create further variations of this in other sites, in other to affect other locations, but at the same time creating a certain continuity with regards to its history and to its ideological content. And of course, with Aragon, he then goes on to say that we could also say that if we detect a type, we could also destroy it, right? We reject it and we create a new type. And he owes this approach. He says that this is only possible when there is enough drivers of change that is given by society, usually through a certain revolution in the economics production of architecture, or it is through genius, right? So I think a good example for this, of course, Aragon did not elaborate much on this. He just said that a figure like Corbusier is someone who does that, who takes on the root structure and then to create new types. And I thought this is an interesting take on Aragon, but also I think it's more interesting if we to understand this displacement of the root form and interior structure via Cohune's displacement of concept. So in Cohune, he would say that we can only understand, let's say, the genius or the innovation of the 5 points of architecture of Le Corbusier that is afforded by the introduction of reinforced concrete construction that allows us to look at architecture that do not follow a load-bearing wall. And Cohune argues that we can only understand this invention precisely. It has occurred because it has displaced what has gone on before, whether it is history or whether it is a certain tropes that has been persisting. And in that sense, it also questions upon modernist claim that there is a complete rupture between architectural modernism and history. And the way Cohune argues for that is this: if we take the two examples here, and this is, I'm sure, very familiar to you, I don't even have to name them, is that we can understand the genius of the 5 points is precisely it is understood the innovation is understood it's in absentia, right? That is, the innovation is bound as a paradigmatic set between the new and the old, and Cohune says that this happens because the high tradition of classical architecture is being replaced here. So for instance, the 5 points, the pilotti, if you see, is a reversal of the classical podium, right? It accepts the piano nobile that is separated from the ground, but the base is now turned from something that is solid to something that is void. The horizontal strip window contradicts the window ogival of classical architecture. The roof terrace contradicts the pitch roof and the attic story of the open air room. The free facade replaces and contradicts the regular arrangement of windows that are stacked one above the other because of the load-bearing facade. And finally, the 5th point, the free plan again displaces and contradicts the load-bearing wall and use it as and turn it into a non-structural partition. So in that sense, we could say that this rejection and the destruction of the interior structure to create something new is also only possible if we are able to appreciate this as a paradigmatic set of what is being displaced and what takes place in return. And it is not unusual, therefore, to find that even when Le Corbusier worked in far-flung places at that time in 1963, in Chandigarh, you could see that this is the assembly hall in Chandigarh. is created with a plan. If you look carefully, it's actually very similar to the plan of Schinkel, right? Where you have a rotunda in a circular temple, a circular form in the center that is then surrounded by a cloister of rooms and on three sides, and then a portico on the other. So this is something that we have always found interesting, that we are able to detect a series. We bring together a certain precedent, detect that series, and then understanding the irreducible structure of the precedent, and then to either create further variations within it or to destroy it, but always still maintaining that historical reference to what it displaces. Another example that I said is important to us with regards to pedagogy is Duron. And Duron, I think we could understand the work of Duron. Duron is actually more of a teacher than an architect. He actually hasn't built anything. He made a couple of proposals, but his contribution is really in instituting, or is an attempt to create a scientific knowledge of architecture. So Duron, his body of work could be understood in two parts. The first is the recueil, and the second is the Précis. The recueil essentially is a series of A2, A1 plates of drawing that brings together buildings to the same scale, but from different places, from different programs, that he feels shares the same characteristic for analysis. The Précis takes on from this analysis to reduce them to its irreducible, to its deep structure, to its irreducible structure, and then to give lessons to the way in which it could be recombined to create architectural solutions. Now, I think what's important in reading Duron is, of course, his scientific method is important, but what is also crucial, is equally, I think, crucial, is to understand the context that he was working in. Duron was working at a time in which the rise of the engineers and sciences begins to challenge the received knowledge of architecture that is given by the ancients or given by the books of Palladius, Camossi, Serie, and so on. And the challenge was, of course, at that time, was to create structures like this, building types that are emerging, that are public in nature. It is to be built for the revolutionary society, and with the introduction and rise of new materials. So Duron really, in a sense, attempted to create an architectural knowledge that is both rational and scientific in his terms, so that they are able to be taught. But more than that, I see that this act is actually political as well as social, because being a revolutionary citizen at the period of French Revolution is to, in a sense, the larger project of Duron is, in a sense, to democratize the profession of architecture, the knowledge of architecture, away from the monarchy, away from divinity, and to make this knowledge rational, teachable, and therefore is able to accommodate various stakeholders as well as common men or students into this profession. And in a sense, to allow architecture to be a profession of the people, to serve the people. So I think in that sense, therefore, you see that the pedagogy that, or the method that Duron does here in recueil and Précis, both left and right, is that the recueil brings together, as I said, buildings that shares a certain characteristic through a method of comparative analysis that is borrowed from biological science, as it were, to compare, let's say, the stomach of different frogs, right? And to understand the functionings of the stomach. And once that is understood in the Précis, Duron would then, here, if you see, this is what he calls the ensemble, the orifice, the compositional method starts with a certain structural axis, and the structural axis either denotes a certain points of columns or certain walls, and then from there it generates its plan, its section, and therefore its elevation. So I think both Argan and Duron in many ways influence the pedagogy a lot. And therefore, in the studios that I run over the years, we as well as in the AA, we always actually start by the careful selection of precedents, and they are selected not because that they share the same function, but they are brought together because they share a certain propensity for accommodation. And they are selected precisely that it provides a certain reading, that the deep structure and the reducible structure also has a certain cultural and ideological content that fits and illuminates the kind of research theme that we are investigating at that particular point in the year. So I'll share, let's say, two projects that we've conducted with you. This one was done about 3-4 years ago. It's one of the 3 years that we were looking at the urbanization, the future of urbanization in China. This was the 3rd part. We started off with the mega plot and then the cross-border cities. This was the last one that looks at the recent rural urbanization in China. So yeah, the title of the studio was provocative. It's contentious to say that, to turn the countryside into a city. Of course, if we take it literally, it's an act of foolery, if not outright scandalous. But if we were to understand the city with all its qualities and propensity for accommodation, civility, and stimulation, and if we could actually infuse this very essence to the countryside whilst retaining the unique characteristic of this countryside, we felt that it is able, therefore, to bridge the rural-urban divide that is actually so pronounced in China, and it's also one of responsible for the broadest form of social inequality in China. So, so the context of this was that at that time in 2013, 2015, rural urbanization was seen at that time with Li Keqiang was one of the key drives to further stimulate the economy and also to drive the urbanization of China. And the prediction was that by 2025, the urbanization rate of China will reach 70%, and it will affect 300 million by 2028, 2025. And this urbanization will no longer be focused on large cities, but the growth will be in rural towns and small and agricultural land across China. So this is really a continuation of the Building a New Socialist Countryside program of that preceded it about in 2006, and it was developed against the backdrop of rural unrest and the urgent need to secure food production, because farming in China is very, very inefficient, because the farming land is fragmented actually by villages, unlike, let's say, in the US, where you have swath of farmland that is punctuated by barns rather than by villages, and also to uplift the living standard of rural areas. So there are 3 types of so-called urban villages that we find now in China. So one is that it is, you could see here, this is a very famous one, where you find villages that are stranded in a city surrounded by high density developments, because this is where migrant workers started to build their own houses, and then they become bigger and bigger before the state begins to encircle them with larger, higher density developments. The second one is the destruction of villages that are close to the periphery of the city and the edge of the city as the metropolis grow, and this too begins to come into contact and creates conflict. But the one that we focus on was the third one. The third one is essentially involves the whole-scale demolition and amalgamation and rebuilding of villages to form new agriculture towns. And this was, this is done by the state to address the imbalance between urban and rural areas. And the drive to urbanize the rural area is to, for their 4 points, essentially is to safeguard the agricultural land, to improve the living conditions of the rural area, to stem the flow of migrant workers from rural to urban after 30 years of rapid urbanization. And if they can, they would also like to reverse it and to increase the GDP of these rural areas. So this creation of new towns, you can see here there are 4 villages. When we were working, these are the sites that we were working. It is in Zhongmao country at the outskirts of Zhengzhou. So this agriculture town involves the demolition of 4 villages and to amalgamate them, involving 4,400 inhabitants into something like this, right? It's called here, this is created by the LDI, state-sponsored design institute, the Tushan New Town. So yeah, it's distinctively urban with an efficient grid composed of semi-detached houses laid out along east-west street, and then with the main living room facing south, and then the north-south grid, which you see here, that runs across the center, brings together entertainment halls, schools, and then the usual axis, the north-south axis that you find so much in Chinese urbanism. So we've visited the site and looked at another recently built agricultural town, and this is called Madusheku. It is located just northeast to the site that we were looking at, and it essentially has the same layout, housing types, and amenities. So, and when we visited the site, we spent several weeks there, and we spoke a lot to the residents there, and without fail, they were lamenting the dwellings, the insular layout of the dwellings, and in a sense, to them, that insularity creates a certain abandonment of a generation-long connection, and it's a physical one, but also a cultural one to the agriculture fields. So, and we were very surprised when we saw that actually villagers here continue to grow vegetables and fruit trees in leftover common spaces, in roundabouts even, because they really wanted to regain that association with the land. Because in a sense, they do not need to farm anymore, because their farmland is taken away from them. They are compensated by the state, and they do get remittance from their children that are working in the cities. But this is what we see, that in fact the access road that you saw that was designed for luxury cars to travel has been turned into drying areas for corn and other produce. And that these streets, we found, became an extension of the town square, common spaces for villagers to sort and dry their harvests. And then when you go and see the communal hall that was designed for them, you could see that they are completely abandoned, glass shattered, full of rubbish. But if you look at the streets, they are gathering space where grandparents, elderly parents are still involved in the millennial tradition of working close to the land. So it's no longer an economic necessity, but also one which is social and cultural. So therefore, the current approach we felt has disconnected the villagers from their role as farmers, and a situation with both economic and cultural implication. First, the new homes that they have received in return for the agricultural lands are actually inferior investments. And the houses in the village, which is considered as real estate to them, are unproductive and unlikely to rise in value significantly. In fact, it has dropped, especially when you compare the residential properties in the city. So second is that the villagers have lost, as I said, this cultural connection to working the land and the social solidarity that comes from collective farming. So we thought that an alternative to this tactic is to actually compact these villages less and to incorporate the half of the farmland that the villagers still own into a layout of the new town. So this approach, we felt, achieves the goal of increasing agricultural land for efficient mechanized farming that the state is driving for, and at the same time sustain an existing livelihood and occupation for the village within this ring. So this strategy actually promotes 2 types of farming: on the release and regularized farmland, which immediately outside the town, and land-intensive crops like grains can be planted and tended mechanically on the outside and increase the overall yield. And then higher value cash crops can then be planted on smaller pieces of redistributed farmland within the new new towns. So it's an approach that integrates smaller scale, let's say, organic vegetable gardens and fruit orchards into the village's new dwellings. So this, and along the periphery of the town, we thought that small processing plants could form larger new towns that can transform this larger small scale produce into more valuable products, moving up the value chain of the product itself. And likewise, villages therefore could establish weekend markets, attracting city dwellers, and even using e-commerce that is very, very common in the platforms in China to increase the worth of their product. But I think more importantly is that it retains the livelihood of the villagers with the less compact village, but also to create this, to revive this connection to the land. So looking back at the pedagogy that I just mentioned, so we made a lot of studies and survey on the site and looked at the irreducible element of the countryside city. And it's basically the three-sided courtyard house. So this three-sided courtyard house is quite different from its urban counterpart, and it's because they are made, which is the four-sided courtyard house that I just showed you earlier, is that they are made of several independent pavilions that are bound together by the pavilions that I mentioned. But what is important here is that there is the missing fourth pavilion, which is at the front of the gate, because it allows tractors to move into the courtyard. The courtyard is used for drying of grains that you see here, and they use as workspace and for drying. And on the left and right is either the tool shed or for farming and animals farms. So one of the projects I thought to share with you is a project by Augustine and Lee. They call it Within the Frame. So they started with a figure that occurs at several scale. So a large frame, a large outer frame, circumscribes the reconstituted village, and then a smaller inner frame contains the fields for communal farming and a forest. So this central area is deliberately left empty of buildings, so it's able to contain and capture what they call the beauty of the expansive field. And then the space between the two frames is then divided into an alternating sequence of agriculture fields and dwelling, this bipolar relation that I was mentioning just now. So some of the agriculture fields are shared, others are an amalgamation of private garden strips, so it is flexible and it is left to the villagers to arrive at the best configuration. And then the dwellings are composed again by an alternating pavilions with small courtyards. And it breaks down the courtyard house to an even finer grain and drawing nature close to individual rooms. So in a way, one could move from the largest expansive field to the shared fields, and then to courtyards, to rooms, and to even smaller forecourts. So the organization element of the frame is repeated and is varied, and it forms a large and small, open and closed, and composed of pavilions and courtyards, striated by an intimate gardens and expansive agriculture fields that I said. And to conclude, it's an experience, as Augustine and Lee has said, it's an experience of moving through the spaces, is imbued with the bipolarity of the countryside and the city. So one more project before we move on to the practice. So this is more recent. After looking at China, we felt that we looked at something closer to home. This was last semester's work, so quite fresh still. We called it Midtown, Mid-Rise, Mid-Door. The studio for the semester, we considered three recent and significant shifts that we thought was affecting the design of collective housing in London. The first is the viability and desirability of working from home because of the pandemic, the emphasis of low carbon construction, and the requirements for energy efficient dwellings. And our response was framed by three interrelated themes at their various scales. So the first one is Midtown. It addresses the changing nature of workspace and their related amenities brought about by the pandemic. One do not need to go all the way down 3 miles or even all the way down to the urban centers for work, but they allow us to think of work and home as increasingly being a single space. And this compelled us to rethink the concept of the 15-minute city, perhaps to a 5-minute city, right? No longer at the scale of a district, but at the scale of a building or several buildings. And it points to the challenge, again, of how we integrate workspace close to dwelling and alongside its third spaces, the resources and amenities that is able to bridge and support the first two. The second theme is mid-rise, and it deals with the potential for carbon neutral construction offered by CLT. And we know that the most effective scale for this is the mid-rise, between 6 to about 12 stories. And with the recent building regs, is now brought down back to 6 stories, where the structural spans could afford and to follow the modularity of dwelling rooms. And the third theme, mid-door, challenges the fabric-first approach of passive house in housing design that treats the static temperature and airtight approach we felt often produces thick and solid facade and leaves largely housing typologies unexamined. So instead, we adopted what we call an adaptive comfort approach and explore the potential of using in-between spaces, what we call mid-doors, as environmental buffers that mediates 2 temperature zones of different microclimatic zones, but also spaces that allows us to dwell in rather than to pass through and have certain temporality within the day in terms of how we occupy it. So the site that we looked at is in Hackney Wick, working together with LLDC and Paul Karakushevik, looking at the 2 sites that to the north of the viaduct, reaching from the west right up to the canal facing Queen Elizabeth Park. So I'll just show you one project here by Soo In Kim and Gordon Yu. So Kim and Yu called the project Breezeway. So their starting premise was to acknowledge that temperatures are rising across Europe, the UK as well. And the graph is predicting a temperature that continues to rise in the next 5 to 10 years. And yet, at the same time, you see that of all the so-called countries, developed countries in the world, even in temperate zones, UK has one of the lowest households with air conditioning. That is to say that the housing stock and the housing typology is not suited for the changing climate that we see today. So they brought together 2 precedent types. And it's a reducible structure. One is they call the dog trot house, and the breeze, which has the breezeway as the central space of the building, which is a common space, and that it is wide enough and is orientated to the prevailing winds to allow all rooms to be cooled naturally by the breeze, and in that sense, making it zero energy or even negative energy. The other was the precedent that they were interested in, which is, I think you may be all familiar with this, is Sana's Gifu Kitagata apartment, rethinking the Engawa space not only as a circulation space, but as a common space and a shared space that could be a room in itself and or as extension of the rooms when the rooms facing it are slit open. So bringing those two precedent together in its reducible structure, they have conceived of a series of rooms that are deep, almost like 4-room deep, and are then flanked by supporting rooms on either side. So this creates a series of rooms, a unit that is 1 unit deep plan in the housing block, but one that allows that very cross ventilation that I spoke about. So they also looked at CLT structure and the way in which the efficient arrangement of the modularity of the room creates a certain timber tectonic in itself. And this is that very view of the breezeway that they spoke about. It is a sequence of open and closed space. If you see from moving from room to room, if they were to to be viewed from left to right, but a sequence of collapsed rooms if you were to view them from top to down. So looking also at certain the shoulder months as well as the summer months, these spaces are transformable to different use, whether they are workspace, whether they are living rooms and dining rooms, they are completely interchangeable depending on the season and the time of day. So here it's one of the combination of the, according to the time of day, how flexibility and is imbued within the plan itself. And to create moments like this, right, that the breezeway becomes one that draws from its precedent, but also one that has its own validity and relevance in the context in which it latches on in the proposition. So on the facade of the building is another series of rooms where they call the enlarged Nggawa space, where the loggia is again conceived of a series of rooms that are interconnected. And they also, in a way, display visible life of a collective housing onto the facade of the building. So here you could see that the lodges are arranged almost like an enfilade in plan, but also in section, where glimpses of your neighbors and shared spaces creates that kind of common space and sociality that that both the authors have championed for. So here you see the lodges as rooms being afforded on the facade itself. Is a combination of a tectonic of CLT, but one that is also protected from the elements by a movable screen. So the project is a combination of accumulation of the dwelling units to create a block and also as towers. It brings ground floor yard spaces that Hackney Wick is known for, where work actually bleeds out to the yard space itself. And here the facade draws that kind of collective space towards the canal facing QE2 Park. So I'll turn now attention to practice before we run out of time. So again, I think looking at the etymology of the word practice, it originated from 15th century, and I like this definition a lot. It says that to practice means is to teach by exercise, to train and to drill. So I think this is in a sense what is different from, let's say, teaching and pedagogy, is that we are always confronted with the briefs that are not written by us, but one that is always given to us, right? And the challenge is always to reconcile often conflicting desires and impossible demands by various stakeholders. And because of these conflicting demands, we felt that to approach this, to ameliorate this, to resolve this productive tension, an approach, as I said, to bring forth an accommodative framework to it is one that we felt is incredibly useful and helpful. So let's start with, I will just show you very few, only 3 projects. So I thought let's start with Oasis Terraces. So this was completed about 2 years ago, 1.5 years, 2 years ago. It's a new generation of neighborhood centers for a housing estate like this. This is all public housing in Singapore. It's for the Housing Development Board in Singapore. And when we first started, the brief that was prepared by HDB called for, in their words, the creation of a new typology. They said, an integrated neighborhood center that will bring together communal amenities, shopping, and polyclinic that is sandwiched between an LRT station to the south and a waterway to the north. So the focus of the brief, unlike, let's say, developer-driven commercial brief, is that it asked us to provide a generous amount of public space to strengthen and to promote community bonding. So we thought that because it's a new typology, we felt that it's true that this typology do not exist in Singapore. And in fact, what we see in terms of shopping is this, the ubiquitous mall, superfluous monuments of consumption that is seen as public activity, as Kolas would say. And the role is in this type is really to internalize all activities, drawing the lifeblood from the streets and the city. And then on the opposite end, the polyclinic, in which we have to design into this new type, and hospitals, let's say, are designed this way, often as independent buildings set away from all other programs and resources that is associated with a lively urban realm. And the closest independent typology for a community center historically is the town hall. And in Singapore, there's no town hall, so to say. So where do we look for precedent? So we thought that the main challenge for this project is not only to bring together these three disparate programmatic components into a new building type, but also to harness an architectural grammar that we thought would create a meaningful communal space. And if possible, to script a programmatic strategy that will foster this sense of belonging that they've asked. So where do we look for precedents? So we thought that with 80% of Singaporeans living in public housing. So the architecture of HDB has grown over the years that we thought could be termed as a common architecture. And it really accommodates a cross-section of society, and we thought that therefore it in a sense become an architecture that really could accommodate the plurality of life. So the architecture of HDB, especially from the 70s and 80s, really we thought had this quality of an open framework. And it can be argued that one of the most successful element of this let's say, container of social life is the void deck on the ground floor. It's an open structure that we thought could really move from a poetic emptiness in wait for social life to unfold, as Rossi would say, to a space of celebration. Let's say here, a Malay wedding, or even in death, this is a Chinese funeral happening in the same space. And also a space where kids hang out, they play football and games. And we thought that this really offers us what we see as an architecture, as a framework. So our approach is really to draw this precedent and architecture of public housing. And we wanted to create this typology that suppresses the visual noise of shopping and the clinical architecture of hospitals, right? And instead, to create, first and foremost, a communal architecture. So this communal spaces are expressed in three ways. So it's really about framing communal life. The first one is an all-weather community event space. And the second one is a cascading communal garden. And the third is to revalidate the veranda space that we find in British tropical colonial architecture. So the first thought when we did this was that we felt that the center should be conceived as a singular building, although there were three clear programs, separate programs. So it's a singular building that frames and cradles a garden, and the garden fronts the waterway, creating a natural amphitheater towards the water edge. And then the garden cascades down the entire height of the building, and it draws program and dining activities right down to the water edge. Then a gentle ramp provides easy access to all the gardens and terraces. They articulate the surface into the zigzag ramps. They articulate the slope into several terraces, and they define the programs within it. So shopping is placed behind the facade, it's visible, it's vibrant. The eating activities spill out onto the verandas, but they never drown out the public realm. So these terraces now that it's built, they're filled with communal spaces. You see here a playground fronting the pediatric clinic. And as the garden matures, and they do mature quite quickly in tropical climate, the ramp now cuts across the terraces, and with each turn, revealing different pockets of communal spaces. Here you see a hammock, a seat, a platform, and for people to stretch out on. And as you reach towards the top and to the roof and then turn your gaze, the view really cascades down to the waterfront. And the terrace also continues to the roof, and the roof is used both for urban farming as well as exercise areas for senior citizens. And actually, I was once on site and I actually saw an old couple, a lady and a man, and he was using actually his Zimmer frame, actually moving along the ramp as an exercise space to reach the top of the roof. And I thought that was really wonderful that people use the building that way. So together, we felt that the communal space envelopes the entire project. It's accessible from ground and all the way to the roof. So upon framing the cascading gardens, the second act was defining as a sheltered community plaza. So this is defined as a 4-story tall volume, is sheltered from the elements, strategically place at the crossing of the waterway and the pedestrian bridge that lands in front of it. And the space is framed by a double column that gives it a facade, a plated grid, ABAB rhythm with very, very simple means. And when it rains and the sun is most hottest in the afternoon, blinds will drop down to shade the space. And this deliberately porous facade, we felt both defines, but also allows permeation to go through this threshold. So each floor is from the bottom all the way to top is surrounded by open terraces and hanging gardens that overlooks the communal space. And they really become the key feature of the elevation. So the facade really possesses the kind of depth that overlays the content that is vibrant, but also the nature that surrounds it. So along its perimeter are all veranda spaces. So here one could dine both close to the waterway, the gardens, kids could spill out into the terrace, and it really creates the vibrancy of the space. So even the service facade is cladded with precast stained concrete with this intercolumnation, and it creates that animated facade that we talk about. So in conclusion, so it's on a meta level, the project really offered us an opportunity to think about architecture's wider role in conceiving and cultivating a sense of community. Now, more often than not, architecture like public housing like this are derided for their restraint and its repetition. But we thought that precisely these qualities that makes this architecture so familiar to Singaporeans. And it really, we thought, is such a great example of architecture acting as a mute background, as a framework for accommodation that enables diversity to flourish. And in here we kind of distilled this learnings and precedents, in a sense, into a single artifact for the city. So a second project before I end, this one is in India now. It's for an ashram, the Srimad Ratchandra Ashram Mission. The site is actually in Dharampur. It's about 4 hours drive from Mumbai. The brief that was given to us is to create a satsang hall, which is translated to English as a discourse hall for 5,000 people, which is used for a meditation and discourse, and for sermons and lectures, and also to hold different meditations of different rooms, and that is also supported by library and classroom. So the available site to us is you see the site is placed on a plateau, is in the shape of a crescent, and the site is really at the middle of this crescent. And if you see that place right at the top in the middle ridge. So when completed, the ashram will house a live population of about 10,000 people, and the satsang hall, being the main building, is therefore situated in the middle of this crescent, facing down the valley towards the west. So the starting point and the precedent of this is that 5-seater satsang hall is informed actually by Jainism's concept of samavasaran, where translated it means essentially is that through the aggregation of knowledge, through discourse and learning as building blocks, this discourse brings one ever closer to enlightenment, right? And in that sense, you will see that this spiraling up towards the building blocks of knowledge and learnings that spiral up towards enlightenment, you can see that they are reified and very evident in all Jain temples. So this aggregation of self-similar elements creates the shikara, right? That reaches to the sky. And also, if you were to enter a Jain temple, also if you look at the ceiling, the same self-similar elements are rotated, and as they rotate, they create that very ceiling and self-similar elements that becomes an infinity towards the sky. So therefore, the satsang hall thus consists of 13 stacked rooms, and the rooms get smaller the higher they go, and they are stacked and rotated. So this rotation also aligns the entrance to the building, to the temple on the right, to the dining hall to the left of the image here, and then another amphitheater facing the hill. So, and the rooms are rotated 45 degrees on every floor as they are stacked. And as they accumulate, they begins to create a silhouette that is, in a way, quite similar to the shikara, but somewhat flatter, because these are rooms that are inhabited rather than as building blocks. So the building will be clad, when we designed it, will be clad by chip marble strip. And we look at the plan as the largest hall with a seating of 5,000 devotees. They are placed on the ground floor. And this column-free structure holds 4 large, slightly curved arch that transfer all the loads from the roof above into this column-free drum, which has a diameter of 55 meters, which is huge. So the main foyer, if you see on the 4 cardinal axes, is accessible from actually 8 corners of the building, and the main entrance is actually facing the valley. Is formed by 2 angle vestibules, allowing men and women to enter separately, but they are never segregated in that sense. So the drum, once you enter, is immediately visible and felt in the foyer, allowing intuitive wayfinding. And the main hall really sits in the center. You can see here, sits 5,000 people. And the stage is slotted into the arches, the 2 arches that I spoke of on one side of the drum. And they are cladded with perforated timber for acoustic baffles. And if you see in here, there are actually no seatings in the main discourse hall, because all the devotees sit cross-legged. They are slightly sloped, but there are no seating to this. So there are 4 circulation that connects the ground floor to the balcony level, and then as they rise up to other classroom, and then further up to smaller meditation room, and then finally culminating with the meditation room, with the most sacred meditation room at the topmost lantern. So here the volume tapers upwards and ends with a skylight, in a sense that it's a view that begins to disappear to infinity. So these are some of the side images that we have of recent. You begin to see the drum being constructed here, the rooms that are rotated, as I said, 45 degrees, slightly curved to create a concave surface, so they're more welcoming. You could also see the drum being inscribed on the plan, and the way in which the curved arch transfers the load from the top all the way down. So this is now slightly further up. As it gets built, you can see the intersection of the drum and the rooms and the arches in this image. I thought that was quite spectacular on this one, and the perforation of the elevation is now being constructed, and the drum is being done. So this is before they have taken down the scaffolding, but you can see the way in which the 2 arches intersect and the 55-meter radius that is seen. So when we started, we wanted to clad the building with the curved facade with marble, because marble is very common for Jain temples. But of course, it becomes too costly actually to lay out marble on the curved surfaces. So we actually looked at an ingenious way, perhaps a very cost-effective way to do that. One is to use to break them down to very, very small elements. And here the small elements both is allowed to create very fine curvature of the building, but also create a very, very beautiful texture. So I will just end. The last project is the new Singapore State Courts. So it's a competition that we won. When we first started as an office, we didn't go through this house extension route that most architects went through. We were lucky, but also has its challenges. But essentially, it's a very, very tight site. It's next to the Octagon building, which is the existing courts at the time, and it's a very tight site that has to hold a very, very large building. So we felt that the existing state courts then was incredibly solid, and with very, very deep plans. And they are so because in all court buildings you have to maintain the separation of 3 key circulation: the circulation of the judges, the accused or the defendant, and the public. So it often creates an architecture that has an atrium in the center and almost fortress-like elevation on the outside. So we actually turned this around and said that what we wanted to do was to create an incredibly porous building, an open building. So we divided the project to 2, and comprises of actually two towers. A thinner tower on the left-hand side that houses the staff functions, the judges and the supporting staff. And then the front tower, or we call the front tower to the right, is the publicly accessed tower that holds all the different courtrooms together. And then between the two, we begin to hold to join the two by bridges. So therefore, you see now this is being built, just completed about a year back. It took a long time because such a big building. So it comprises of two towers that just slides above one, just slides off each other, revealing one to the other, and is connected by bridges. So as it meets the ground, the interface with the octagon, which is conserved, is joined by a pavilion with a raised plinth as a shared entrance between the two. So I think it in a very, very tight site. So I think it fits quite well. It has a certain presence within the site. But what really drove us in this project was to think about a public building as important as the State Courts, which is a high-rise building reimagined as a courtroom, was to actually look at the two persistent architecture in the site, which is Chinatown. And the two persistent architecture or dominant type here is the shop house, which is 3 stories, 2-story, very, very granular. And at the backdrop is the ubiquitous high-rise, which consists of repetitive floor plans, repetitive plates that is brought all repeated all the way up. So we wanted to bring these two very familiar and persistent architecture to a single gesture, thereby rethinking the high-rise as a series of platforms or ground planes that are repeated but with differential heights. And on each platform, we place courtrooms that has the same granularity and dimensions as the shop house. And on this platforms then is landscape, so that they lushly landscape, so that they create spill out spaces, places to rest and to decompress for the public and for the people who use the court, because court proceedings are often incredibly stressful. And then the third element that we brought into the building and to bring into a single moment was the moment of, this is used to be the former Supreme Court of Singapore, that uses the classical idiom, right, of a rational and rational architecture, and in which it is used a lot for courthouses by the British and during the Age of Enlightenment, in which when rationality is and consistency is important, and it alludes to the same analogous relationship between justice. So the same porticoed entrance, in the sense we have used here, is depicted on what we call an open facade. So there is, in a sense, no glazing at the outer skin, but it consists of a series of columns that are spaced from one to the other, and it bunches up towards the corner, but it relaxes towards the center of the building. So on the courtrooms boxes itself, we also draw a certain, we use a precast pigmented concrete that is then stained by hand, and it alludes again to the kind of richness and texture of the roof of the shop house. So we made many tests here. They are very, very large planes. They are about 6 meters tall and about 1.8 meters wide. It has different width, and so that as your eye moves from left to right, there's a certain fluted undulation that draws your eye from in the horizontal plane. And as it goes up, so the different striation and openings also has that certain modulation and that certain handmade quality to the building. So as it is placed on the side, I think it creates an incredibly rich and diverse facade. There's somewhat of the vibrancy of the shop house that you see. This is the view that takes off from the lift lobby and frames the octagon, the conserved building. And this is the view towards the entrances to the courts. And at the same time, at the courtroom we use very, very economical means of birch ply that is laser cut, and then with openings for acoustic control. And at the back tower, as I mentioned, it is created by a very simple grid that expands and closes. It expands where you need views, and it contracts where the services are. And also it expands and contracts as it moves vertically upwards, creating a rhythm that draws your eye to the sky. So they're connected by overall 38 bridges. So these bridges are almost a moment of transition between the working space of the judges to a space of public performance in dispensing a judiciary duty. At the bottom, between the two towers, are a largely landscape platform. This is all open to the public. So yeah, I really love this image because it really brings together the three moments of the city, the shop house in the turn of the century, the 1960s high rises, and then our own addition, also viewed alongside the Supreme Court, drawing some of the elements of the Supreme Court. That's it. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was really inspiring, brilliant. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Shall we open it to questions from the audience? I think you can raise your hand, you can turn on your cameras, you can also write your question in the chat if you have one.
Thank you so much, Chris.
I can mute myself, you can unmute.
Okay. Now, there was something very interesting in the way that you linked the theoretical departure point and both pedagogical project and your practice. So I wonder if you were to position yourself as practice in Rossi's definition of, let's say, the rule and the exception, it seems that you sit somewhere in between, as if you give more, let's say, agency to the rules in order to unfold something exceptional. I mean, so how would you elaborate? I mean, could you a bit elaborate on?
Yeah, no, thanks, Hamid. That's a very good question. Because Rossi really looms large in the front bit. But I think the things that we took from Rossi is the realization that architecture is transparent to function. Yeah, and it has a certain relevance when it persists in time. What we do not emphasize too much or dwell on too much is the more, I would say, idiosyncratic notion of the collective memory, because as we know, collective memory are not easy to access. And also, I think with Rossi was largely working in a European context. So I think because we are working in a more global context, so I think, as I always tell with the stakeholders that we work with, our reach is global, but our response is local. So that is to say that it really depends on each and every site that we work in. And when we confront a particular site or a city, we always try to look at the typical or the persistent architecture of the city, because the architecture we felt that has persisted and therefore they become typical are those that has been sanctioned by social acceptance and by cultural use. And as such, it becomes a familiar architecture that we could revalidate and abstract and then to, create our own interpretation of that. So therefore, we do not adhere to whether it is exception or whether it is rule, but it really depends on where we find ourselves in working in at that particular time. I think it's of course with Rossi was globalization was ahead of him, right? Much later, and you could see that I think with Rossi some of the unsuccessful projects was, and you see that in Tokyo, for instance, in Fukuoka. Where he begins to create a postmodern architecture of Renaissance building elements in Tokyo. And I think in that sense that betrays his thesis, right? Because if the thesis is about drawing on persistent architectures of the city, then Renaissance architecture is not the persistent architecture of Tokyo or Fukuoka. Yeah, so very quickly that approach becomes the recreation of historical image rather than, that meditation on what is common and what is typical.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Chris, we have two questions from the audience. They are
all right.
They are put on the chat. So the first one is from Jerome.
Okay.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for the presentation. can you discuss a bit more about the relationship between Durand's Recueil and Precise? How does the typology studies inform the synthesis of design?
Okay.
That's just the second chapter of your PhD. So
exactly right, Platon. So that's the second chapter of the PhD. It's a long one, so it's very hard to answer in one question. But if I have to summarize very quickly, the recueil is the moment of analysis of the moment of analysis of precedent using a comparative method that brings buildings to this of the same characteristic. They can be bound together by form, by use, and they are brought together so that the shared characteristic is distilled down to a set of geometric structural axes. This structural axis, almost as a diagram, is then used in the Precise to be recombined to other arrangement and organization to create new buildings. So recueil is the analytical part, the Precise is the productive part, let's say that way. Yeah.
Great. We have another one from Ameya. Sorry, Jerome is firing back. Is it merely a form study?
No, it's not. So it depends what you bring together. In recueil, sometimes Durand brings together formal characteristics that are shared, but sometimes he also brings together churches that share certain organizational characteristics. So in a sense, following Argan, we could say that a type has arisen when we could detect characteristics that are shared. This characteristic could be formal, organizational, structural, ornamental. It could be many ways. But what's critical is that it has to have shared characteristic, because when they have shared characteristic, then we could say that a series of buildings, a series of objects has a reason, and therefore there is that type.
So, great. Ameya is asking the following question. Hi, Chris. Thank you for your presentation. In the operation of the office, how are you able to keep the concerns on the practice and pedagogy separate? Has each project in practice or academia addressed each topic deeply? So I guess it's more a question of organizing your time.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. I think yes. I think one exactly what Platon says is also depending on the time, right? Practice actually is very quick, and we often do not have control over the time that is given. In research and teaching, is longer, obviously, but actually, I do not see that there is a conscious separation between the two. Having said that, I also do not see that there is a linear progression between one to the other. I think the larger metacritical concerns are the same. The pedagogy is clearer and more precise and more methodical in teaching, and it has to be because we are imparting knowledge and helping students to search for design solution through architectural knowledge. But in practice, of course, we have practiced enough the pedagogy to allow us to drop, in a sense, the training wheels. So it becomes more intuitive, it becomes faster. But also in practice, because we do not set the brief, we are also confronted with the challenges of practice, the challenges of urbanization, let's say, that we always are confronted with, and it poses new questions and new concerns that we find fruitful to be posed back to teaching. So in a way, it's involved in one to the other without actually very clear separation, and I welcome that actually.
Great. There is one more question in the chat from Anirudh. Hi, Chris. Thank you for your insightful presentation. Can you elaborate a bit on your model of practice, especially working in partnership and across geographies? How did the practice begin, and where do you see it heading?
Okay, it's a good question again. Well, as I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the lecture, we started off in multiple locations in London, in Mumbai, and then very quickly in Singapore. So because we started in multiple locations and with true spirit of collaboration, and that's why we, or at least when we started, we felt that we really needed a consistent theory, but one that is also flexible enough that will allow us to engage not only people from different, not only, let's say, briefs from very, very different culture and different political contexts, but also working in multiple locations. At that time, let's say 10 years ago, we do not have Zoom, we do not have Microsoft Teams. So we have to have a common framework that we could all work together. So this common framework and this ability to accommodate, it really spans a theoretical concern and even up to the way in which we respond. So I think that's how we started. So it affects our theoretical trajectory in a very fundamental way. Where is it heading? I really don't know. We are very busy right now. I think we keep doing what we are doing, and I think what's is becoming clearer and clearer. We have both a theoretical framework as well as a practical, I would say, method of meeting these challenges, is producing, I think, results that I think are consistent to our concerns and belief of what architecture could be. They are never perfect, and it never could be, and I think they shouldn't, because it is the actual architecture is always a product of compromises, and I use the word compromise in a productive way, right? It's a compromise as a form of accommodation, of resolving conflicts, demands, and so on. So I think we will keep doing this, and we will continue to evolve. And I think as we move forward too, I think the crisis, the climate crisis, is featuring very strongly in our work. It was slightly less so, I would say, about 12 years ago, but for the last 8 years, I didn't show you today, with our net zero energy building and our zero carbon neighborhood in Paris, I think climate change is also something that we are considering very seriously.
There's one more question from the audience, but can I follow up and ask you something myself?
Yes, Platon.
I'm really impressed with your also involvement with the public domain, right? So you are not only abroad but also in London. So you are you have a really important engagement with politics. I mean, not in I'm saying it again in a very pure sense of the word. So can you talk a bit about that, and how do you see the role of the architect as a public intellectual, or as a consultant, as a I don't know exactly what's the exact definition of what we do and what we are, but I think also this is a problem for the practice, I guess, the question of what is a public commission versus a private one.
Yes.
The painful process of competitions, of dealing with administration in various levels. So, can you speak it?
Yes. No, I think that's very important, Platon. It's a very, very good question. Yes, we have always been aware of the political dimension of the project, and we approach it really through, I think you know this very well with the projective cities as well, is through the idea of the city, because essentially the ideas of the city is the reification of the idea that could be held in common, and they are reified through the architecture of the city that again draws from architecture that has persisted, architecture in a sense that is familiar. So depending on each site and each brief that is given, we really try to figure forth this common space, this architecture that is familiar, that is relevant, that is identifiable, but at the same time also strangely different, because we as designers have our own interpretation of that. So if you see in Oasis Terrace, we actually draw lessons from public housing, where I think usually architects wouldn't even look at, saying that we draw from public housing, because they are so let's say it's not a novelty, right? It's not different, but we precisely wanted to do this consciously. The other one was, let's say, the state courts is very political. It's a huge, in fact, it's the biggest public building when it was built for Singapore, and again we drew on three moments: the familiar, ubiquitous high-rise, the shop houses, but also drawing a historical dialogue and relationship with the former Supreme Court, but again in a different typology in the high-rise. So I think they are definitely there. They are politics. Let's say the political, in the sense that it is about the idea that could be held in common. It's let's say Aristotle's nomos that is then reified into an artifact of the city.
Great, thank you so much. We have one more question, I guess,
Yes.
from the audience, from Critic. Thanks, Chris. It's an interesting experience to be in the audience in your presentation. I see that you have incorporated your pedagogy with practice, and my question is, would you think this as a kind of framework to shaping the global practice as we know it, or more emphasizing the creative academic way and problem solving? I think it's a question of how practice and academia are brought together. Would you think this is a kind of framework in reshaping the global practice, as we are more emphasizing the creative academic way of problem solving? So
I'll try to answer this.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I can only infer that the question is asking: do I think that this pedagogy should shape global practice? I don't know.
I guess so. Yeah. I think it's how we gradually depart from a problem solving practice into one that is much more creative and and away from this older, let's say.
Yes. I would say yes. Yes, absolutely. You're right in the sense the question again, because I would say we are the third generation of architects that has to deal with the challenges of globalization. IMPE is the first, I would say, followed by Colas, and then I think we are the next generation. And I think this again, coming back to the quote, and I love this quote by Ron Witt so much. We are in the world before we are known to the world, which also means that we, in a sense, our identity is the accumulation of all our experiences and our learnings. And therefore, we do not have a single identity or affinity. We are several. And because of that, I think it's also incredibly productive, because it allows us to find association and commonalities with others. And that association and finding commonalities with others requires an accommodative approach, right? Whether it is a pedagogy, whether it's a theoretical framework, I think it allows us to emphasize what is common and what we have, what we share in common, rather than what actually separates us.
Great. Thank you so much.
Alvaro? Yeah.
Yes, I think one last question from Alvaro, that we can close it. How do you think your experience as a Projective Cities tutor influenced in your current teaching and practice?
Oh, very, very much. Very much, right? I think I owe a lot to the experiences, knowledge shared from teaching together with Sam previously with Projective Cities, and then of course with PV, who has been so generous, intellectually generous, as well as a great friend in my PhD, and of course with Platon, Hamid, and the rest, Maria as our PhD group. I think that all this absolutely shaped the practice, no doubt.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Shall we close it here, manager? Shall we wrap it up? Chris, thank you so much for coming back home.
Yes.
This afternoon. and hope to see you very, very, very soon. Hopefully in person.
Yes. No, thank you so much. Yeah, it's always such a pleasure to be among friends. It's an incredible afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.